In the rugged foothills of Montana's Bitterroot Range, where the wind carries whispers of the Old West and the mountains stand sentinel over sprawling ranchlands, sits Evergreen Ranch. To the casual observer, it appears to be just another cattle operation, a weathered homestead, sturdy barns and vast pastures where prized Angus cattle graze beneath an endless sky. But those familiar with its owner, Mason "Ace" Reynolds, understand that appearances can be deceiving. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 52, Ace isn't simply another rancher trying to scratch out a living in the unforgiving western landscape. He's a ghost, a legend, a man whose name once commanded respect and fear in places where law and order were just distant concepts. Now, he's about to remind a crew of modern-day rustlers exactly why some legends are better left undisturbed. The morning frost glittered across the pastures of Evergreen Ranch as Mason "Ace" Reynolds walked the fence line, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp autumn air. Dawn painted the Bitterroot Mountains in hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the 600 acres of prime Montana rangeland that he'd purchased 7 years ago after walking away from a life few could imagine, let alone survive. Ace moved with the fluid grace of a man half his age, belying the years he'd spent as one of the most effective U.S. Marshals in the Special Operations Group, hunting fugitives across terrain where most law enforcement wouldn't or couldn't venture. His weathered face carried lines earned through years of tracking the worst America's criminal element had to offer, but his eyes remained sharp, constantly scanning his surroundings with the habitual vigilance that had kept him alive through countless manhunts. The ranch represented everything he'd fought for during his 23 years with the Marshals Service: peace, solitude, and a slice of the American West worth protecting. Walking away hadn't been easy, but after bringing in his final fugitive, a cartel enforcer who'd left a trail of bodies across 3 states, Ace had known it was time. The violence and darkness had exacted their toll, and Evergreen Ranch offered the chance to build something rather than simply hunt and capture. His morning routine remained as disciplined as any operation he'd ever run. Up at 4:30, coffee brewing in the battered percolator that had been his father's. A thorough check of the property, including the discreet security measures most ranchers would find excessive. Old habits, as they say, die hard. In his former profession, situational awareness wasn't just useful. It was the difference between coming home or coming home in a box. Cutter, his blue heeler, trotted faithfully at his side, occasionally darting ahead to investigate scents only he could detect. The dog had been with Ace from the beginning of his ranch life, a rescue from a local shelter who'd proven to have an instinctive talent for cattle work and a fierce loyalty to his master. "What do you think, boy?" Ace asked, his voice rough from years of barking orders in the field. "Everything looking right this morning." The dog's ears perked forward, his intense gaze scanning the distant tree line before returning to Ace with what seemed like a canine shrug. "All clear, for now." Evergreen Ranch wasn't the largest operation in Clearwater County, but those who knew cattle recognized that Ace's herd of Black Angus was among the finest in the state. Each animal had been carefully selected and bred for hardiness in the Montana climate and premium beef quality. His methodical approach had paid dividends. In just 7 years, Evergreen Angus beef had developed a reputation that commanded premium prices from buyers across the Northwest. His ranch hands, just 4 of them, were local men he'd trained personally, instilling in them the same attention to detail and situational awareness he'd relied on during his marshal's days. Ryan Campbell, his foreman, had been with him from the start. The 30-year-old had initially struggled with Ace's exacting standards, but had come to appreciate the methodical approach that made Evergreen Ranch so successful. Boss runs this place like a tactical operation, Ryan often told the other hands. Everything has a purpose, everything has a place, and nothing happens by accident. He wasn't wrong. The skills that had made Mason Reynolds legendary in law enforcement circles, preparation, observation, and strategic thinking, had translated remarkably well to ranching, where other operations struggled with predators, disease, or theft. Evergreen Ranch seemed to anticipate problems before they materialized. At the eastern edge of his property, Ace paused, kneeling to examine something that caught his eye. A small section of fencing showed signs of tampering. Nothing obvious, but to his trained eye, the wire had been cut and then carefully twisted back together. Someone had been testing his security, probing for weaknesses. A lesser man might have dismissed it as damage from wildlife or weather, but 23 years tracking fugitives had taught Ace to recognize human handiwork. This was deliberate, professional. Even someone with experience had been on his property, and recently. As he examined the fence more closely, his mind catalogued the details automatically. The cuts were clean, made with quality wire cutters, not the hasty work of opportunistic trespassers. The posts showed subtle scuff marks from boots, and the ground held partial prints that told him at least 2 individuals had been here, probably within the last 48 hours. "Cutter, search," he commanded quietly. The blue heeler immediately put, his nose to the ground, quartering the area with practiced efficiency. Within moments, the dog had picked up a scent trail leading deeper into Ace's property, toward the north pasture where his prize-breeding bulls were kept. Following Cutter's lead, Ace moved silently through the morning mist, his body automatically shifting into the tracking stance that had served him so well during his marshal's days. The trail led to a copse of aspens that provided a perfect observation point overlooking the north pasture. Someone had been watching his operation, studying patterns, planning something. Under a fallen log, partially concealed but visible to his experienced eye, lay a small electronic device. Ace recognized it immediately, a cellular trail camera, the kind used by hunters to monitor game movements, except this one had been positioned to capture footage of his ranch operations, not wildlife. "Getting sophisticated, aren't they, boy?" he murmured to Cutter, carefully retrieving the device without touching any surfaces that might hold fingerprints. Modern rustlers had evolved, using technology alongside traditional methods. They no longer simply cut fences and drove cattle away in the night. They studied operations, identified valuable animals, and planned precision strikes that could cost ranchers hundreds of thousands of dollars. Ace had heard rumors of cattle thefts increasing across the county over the past few months. The Russell spread 10 miles east had lost 12 heads of prime breeding stock 2 weeks ago. The Hoffman place south of town had been hit before that, losing 8 pregnant heifers worth nearly $20,000. Local authorities had investigated but found little evidence to work with. But whoever was behind this didn't know they were dealing with a man who had spent his life hunting predators far more dangerous than cattle thieves. Pocketing the camera, Ace continued his inspection, finding 2 more surveillance points before returning to the main house. Each discovery painted a clearer picture. Systematic surveillance, professional equipment, multiple individuals. This wasn't opportunistic theft. It was a planned operation targeting specific ranches. The main house of Evergreen Ranch stood as a testament to the blend of old and new that characterized Ace's approach to ranching. The original structure dated back to the 1890s, built by the first homesteaders to claim this valley. Ace had restored it meticulously, preserving its historical character while discreetly incorporating modern security features that would have impressed his former colleagues. Inside, he removed his worn Stetson and placed it on the antique coat rack by the door, running a hand through his silver-streaked dark hair. The kitchen, with its blend of vintage craftsmanship and modern appliances, served as the heart of the home. Here, He laid out the trail cameras on the solid oak table his grandfather had built, examining each one carefully. The devices were high-end, equipped with cellular capabilities that allowed them to transmit images in real time to a remote receiver. These weren't the tools of amateurs. Whoever had placed them had invested significantly in their operation. As the coffee percolator, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma, Ace connected his laptop to the first camera, bypassing its security, with skills he'd developed during his time with the Marshal's cyber division. Within minutes, he'd accessed the device's memory and transmission logs. "Let's see who you've been talking to," he murmured, his fingers moving efficiently across the keyboard. The camera had been active for 3 days, capturing images of his prize Angus bulls and transmitting them to a server whose location was obscured but not untraceable for someone with his background. More concerning were the night images showing 2 figures moving along his fence line, taking measurements and making notes. Their faces were partially obscured, but Ace could tell they were professionals, their movements economical, their approach strategic. The phone on the kitchen wall rang, pulling him from his analysis. Few people had this number, and fewer still. "Would call at this hour." "Reynolds?" he answered, his voice neutral. "Ace, it's Sheriff Daniels. Got a minute?" The sheriff's voice carried the weight of bad news. "What's happened, Tom?" "Davidson's place was hit last night. 30 heads of his. Registered Angus. Disappeared without a trace. Sophisticated operation. They cut power to his security system, disabled his trucks, and somehow moved 30 full-grown cattle without waking a soul." Ace's jaw tightened. The Davidson Ranch was just 12 miles north of his property, with a similar operation focused on premium Black Angus. Any witnesses? None. By the time Jim realized what happened, they had at least a 5-hour head start. "I've got deputies canvassing, but—" The sheriff's voice trailed off. They both knew how vast the country was, how many back roads and hidden valleys could conceal a cattle truck until the animals were long gone. "I found surveillance equipment on my property this morning," Ace said. "Trail cameras monitoring my north pasture, professionally placed." A moment of silence. "You think you're next?" "I think someone's been doing their homework on the prime. Cattle operations in this county, Davidson's, Russell's, Hoffman's, now surveillance on mine. These aren't random hits. I'll send a deputy out." "No need," Ace cut in. "I've got things covered here. But you might want to check other operations for similar surveillance. These people are planning their hits carefully." After ending the call, Ace stood at his kitchen window, looking out over the ranch that had become his sanctuary. The morning light illuminated the peaceful scene, cattle grazing in the distance, ranch hands beginning their daily routines, the majestic Bitterroot Mountains standing guard on the horizon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Few people in Clearwater County knew the full extent of Mason Reynolds' background. To most, he was just a successful rancher who kept to himself, spoke softly, and ran an efficient operation. Only Sheriff Tom Daniels knew something of his past, having run a standard background check when Ace first purchased the property. What he'd found, or rather, what he couldn't find due to redacted records, had earned the sheriff's respect and an unspoken agreement not to pry further. At Maggie's diner in town, Ace was known as the quiet rancher who ordered the same breakfast: 2 eggs over medium, sourdough toast, black coffee, left generous tips, and rarely engaged in gossip. Maggie Sinclair herself, a sharp-witted widow in her 60s who'd run the place for 30 years, had taken a maternal interest in Ace from the day he'd first walked through her door. "That man's eyes have seen things," she once told her daughter. "Jenny, who helped run the diner, reminds me of my brother after he came back from Vietnam. Carries himself like someone who's walked through fire and came out tempered steel." Ace checked his watch. 6:30 a.m. Ryan and the other hands would be gathering in the bunkhouse for breakfast by now. He needed to alert them to the situation without alarming them unnecessarily. What was coming wasn't something they should be directly involved in, but they needed to be vigilant. Grabbing his hat and slipping his old marshal's badge into his pocket, a habit he maintained even years into retirement, he headed for the door. Cutter fell in at his side, attuned to the subtle shift in his master's demeanor. The bunkhouse sat 100 yards from the main house, a comfortable dwelling Ace had renovated to ensure his hands had a decent place to live. Inside, Ryan, Mike, Thornton, Jamie Cruz, and Sam Wheeler were seated around the large table, plates piled with eggs, bacon, and biscuits that Sam, the youngest at 24, and their unofficial cook, had prepared. "Morning, boss," Ryan called out as Ace entered. "Coffee's fresh." Ace nodded, pouring himself a cup before joining them at the table. The men continued eating, but they'd known him long enough to sense the change in his demeanor. "Something wrong with the north pasture?" Ryan asked, having noticed Ace's early morning inspection route. "Found some surveillance equipment along the property line," Ace replied, his voice matter of fact. "Trail cameras watching our operation, particularly the prize bulls." The hands exchanged glances. News of the recent cattle thefts had been the main topic at the Rusty Spur Saloon for weeks. "Davidson's place got hit last night," Ace continued. 30 heads gone without a trace." "Jesus," Mike muttered. At 36, he was the oldest of the hands and had worked cattle all his life. "That's got to be at least 150,000 in livestock. More like 200,000 given the quality of Jim's breeding stock," Ace corrected. "These aren't opportunistic thieves. They're targeting specific operations with high-value animals." Jamie leaned forward, his dark eyes serious. "You thinking we might be next, boss?" "I'm thinking we need to be prepared for that possibility," Ace replied, meeting each man's gaze in turn. "Starting today, we modify our routines. 2-man teams at all times, regular perimeter checks, and I want the prize bulls moved to the south. Pasture where they're less visible from the road." Ryan nodded, already mapping out the logistics in his head. "What about night security? We've been rotating 1 man on evening checks, but maybe we should double that. For now, maintain normal patterns with enhanced vigilance. I don't want to tip our hand that we've found their surveillance." Ace sipped his coffee, his mind already several steps ahead. "Sam, I need you to make a supply run to town today. Regular items, nothing unusual, but keep your eyes open for unfamiliar faces or vehicles." Sam nodded, understanding the unspoken instruction to gather intelligence without drawing attention. "What about the sheriff?" Mike asked. "Should we be coordinating with his office?" Tom's aware of the situation, but his resources are stretched thin across the county. For now, we handle our own security. Ace stood, placing his empty cup in the sink. "Ryan, walk with me to check the east herd. I want to go over some additional measures." Outside, with the morning sun now climbing higher over the mountains, Ace and Ryan walked toward the eastern pasture. Cutter ranged ahead, periodically checking back as if reporting that all was clear. "There's something you're not telling the others," Ryan said once they were out of earshot of the bunkhouse. Ace smiled slightly. Ryan had good instincts, which was why he'd been chosen as foreman. "The surveillance equipment I found wasn't just professional, it was military grade. Thermal imaging capabilities, satellite transmission options, tamper-resistant cases. This isn't some local rustling operation." Ryan whistled softly. "Organized crime? Maybe. More likely a specialized crew that targets high-end livestock operations. Across multiple states, they study their targets, identify the most valuable animals, and hit with precision. By the time local authorities coordinate a response, the cattle are across state lines or already being processed. They created a small rise that offered a view of the eastern herd, 70 heads of prime Angus grazing peacefully under the Montana sky. "What are we really preparing for, boss?" Ryan asked quietly, Ace's eyes scanned the distant tree line, old habits automatically identifying potential vantage points, avenues of approach, defensive positions. "I'm not just going to wait for them to hit us, Ryan. I'm going to set a trap." Ryan studied his employer carefully. In the 3 years he'd worked at Evergreen Ranch, he'd come to respect Ace's methodical approach and attention to detail. But occasionally, he caught glimpses of something else, a hardness, a tactical precision, in how the older man moved and observed his surroundings that spoke of experiences far beyond ordinary ranching. "You weren't always a rancher, were you?" he asked finally. Ace turned to him, his expression unreadable for a moment before softening slightly. "No," he said simply. "I wasn't. And that's going to be very unfortunate for anyone who thinks Evergreen Ranch is an easy target." As they continued their inspection, Ace's mind was already shifting into a gear he hadn't used in 7 years, analyzing terrain, cataloging resources, and developing contingencies. The Rustlers had no idea who they were dealing with. A man who had spent his life hunting the most dangerous fugitives across America's most unforgiving landscapes. They were about to learn why the name Mason "Ace" Reynolds had once been whispered with fear among fugitives across the western United States, and why some legends are better left undisturbed. 3 days after discovering the surveillance equipment, Ace sat at his desk in the ranch office, reviewing satellite images of the surrounding area. The old roll-top desk had belonged to his grandfather, but the high-resolution monitors and encrypted laptop sitting atop it were thoroughly modern, tools from a life he'd supposedly left behind. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor as Cutter dozed nearby. A map of Clearwater County hung on the wall, red pins marking the locations of recent cattle thefts. A pattern was forming, and Evergreen Ranch sat squarely in its path. The ranch radio crackled to life. "Boss, it's Ryan. You might want to come. Down to the South Ridge. Found something you should see." Ace grabbed his hat and rifle, more out of habit than immediate concern. "On my way. Keep your distance from whatever you find." "Already done." Jamie's keeping watch from the high ground. Outside, Ace mounted his Palomino gelding, Thunder, a horse selected specifically for his steady nerves and intelligence. 7 minutes later, he created the South Ridge where Ryan waited, his own horse ground-tied nearby. "What have we got?" Ace asked, dismounting in one fluid motion. Ryan pointed toward a small clearing about 50 yards downslope. "Tracks. Fresh. Wasn't there during yesterday's patrol." Approaching cautiously, Ace noted the disturbed earth where someone had attempted to conceal their presence and done a decent job by normal standards. But Mason Reynolds had tracked fugitives through swamps, mountains, and deserts when they left far less evidence than this. He knelt, examining the scene with practiced eyes. 3 men, one around 220 pounds, the others lighter. They came up from the creek bed, stayed about 20 minutes, then followed the same path back down. He pointed to subtle indentations in the soil. "They placed something here, probably another surveillance device." Ryan's eyebrows rose slightly. "How can you possibly know there were 3 men just from looking at some disturbed dirt?" Ace smiled thinly. "Same way I know one was smoking Marlboros. One carries a Glock 19. And they were here approximately 4 hours ago when the dew was still on the ground." Following the trail a few yards into the underbrush, Ace discovered what he'd expected, another trail camera, this one more carefully hidden than those he'd found days earlier. He left it in place, but adjusted its angle slightly, just enough, to render its surveillance less effective without alerting the owners that it had been discovered. "They're getting closer to the main operation," he noted, keeping his voice low, "mapping the ranch systematically, establishing our routines." Ryan scanned the surrounding terrain, seeming to see it with new eyes, not just as familiar ranch land, but as terrain that could conceal threats. What's our play, boss? For now, we feed them what they expect to see, normal ranch operations, but we start moving the most valuable livestock to locations they haven't mapped yet. Ace pointed toward a series of draws that cut through the eastern portion of his property. The box canyon beyond Miller's Creek could hold the prize bulls. It's defensible, has water, and isn't visible from any of the surveillance positions they've established. As they remounted and rode back toward the main ranch complex, a distant dust cloud caught Ace's attention. A vehicle was approaching along the main road, the sheriff's distinctive white Chevy Tahoe with Clearwater County markings. "Company," he noted to Ryan. "Want me to head back and organize that move we discussed?" Ace nodded. "Keep it quiet. Regular rotation, nothing that looks like we're responding to a threat. And Ryan," he fixed his foreman with a meaningful look, "make sure everyone is armed but discreetly. Sidearms only for now." Sheriff Tom Daniels had served Clearwater County for 15 years, and the job had etched permanent lines into his weathered face. At 58, he still maintained the fitness of the Army Ranger he'd been in his youth, but today his shoulders carried the additional weight of mounting pressure from the county commissioners about the unsolved cattle thefts. Ace met him by the main house, offering a cup of coffee that the sheriff accepted gratefully. "4 more ranches hit in the last 48 hours, Tom said without preamble, leaning against his vehicle. "Precision operations, just like Davidson's place. In and out with no witnesses, taking only the highest value animals." He fixed Ace with a searching look. "You're on their list, I'm sure of it." "Already found their surveillance equipment on my property," Ace confirmed. "Military grade. These aren't local boys stealing a few heads to sell across state lines." The sheriff's expression darkened. "FBI's finally taking notice. Agents driving in from Helena tomorrow, but I'm not holding my breath. By the time the federal response gets organized, these thieves will have moved on to new territory." "What are you hearing from other countries?" "Similar patterns in Wyoming and Idaho over the past 6 months. Always targeting premium breeding stock, always professional operations. The scale suggests they've got processing facilities lined up, probably false paperwork, to move the animals through legitimate channels afterward." Ace considered this information, adding it to the picture forming in his mind. They've got inside knowledge. Someone who understands ranch operations, knows which animals are most valuable. "That's my read too," the sheriff agreed. "Could be someone working the stock shows, sales barns, maybe even a corrupt vet or livestock inspector." Movement near the bunkhouse caught Ace's attention. A truck he didn't recognize was pulling up, a feed supply logo emblazoned on its side. Not their regular supplier, and they hadn't ordered anything. "Tom," he said quietly, "you know anyone driving for Miller's feed supply these days?" The sheriff followed his gaze. "Miller sold that business 3 years ago to some outfit from Idaho." "Why?" "Because we don't use Miller's, and I didn't order any feed." Ace's hand moved casually toward the small of his back, where his Colt 1911 resided in a worn leather holster, a habit from his martial days he'd never abandoned. "How about you introduce yourself while I circle around back?" Understanding immediately, Sheriff Daniels nodded and walked toward the truck, one hand resting near his service weapon. "Afternoon," he called out cheerfully. "Looks like you might have taken a wrong turn." From his position moving between outbuildings, Ace could see the driver stiffen slightly at the sight of law enforcement. The man, mid-30s, muscular build, with a nervous energy that set off every alarm in Ace's experienced mind, consulted a clipboard. "Delivery for Evergreen Ranch? 5 tons of custom feed mix." The man's accent suggested Texas or Oklahoma. "Not local. I handle all the purchasing for Evergreen," the sheriff replied easily, maintaining his casual demeanor. "Don't recall ordering anything from Miller's recently." A second man emerged from the passenger side, younger, wiry, with the hyper-aware movements of someone accustomed to watching his back. "Must be some mix-up in the paperwork. Mind if we use your phone to call back to the office?" By now, Ace had positioned himself behind the truck, noting the mud deliberately covering the license plate and the unusual weight distribution that suggested the vehicle carried something heavier than feed. Through the truck's rear window, he could make out a third man still inside, his hand suspiciously out of sight. The pieces clicked into place in Ace's mind. This wasn't a delivery. It was reconnaissance under cover of a plausible ranch visit, allowing them to map the central operations, locate security systems, and identify the main house layout. The kind of preparation professionals made before a major theft. Sheriff Daniels had reached the same conclusion. "Tell you what," he said, his friendly tone unchanged though his posture had shifted subtly. "Why don't I escort you back to the main road? Easy to get turned around in these hills?" The two men exchanged glances, clearly reassessing their options now that law enforcement had complicated their plan. "Sure thing, officer. Sorry for the confusion." As they turned to re-enter their vehicle, Ace stepped into view at the rear of the truck. "Before you go," he called out casually, "mind if I check your cargo? Had some problems with weevils in feed shipments lately." The change was immediate. Both men's expressions hardened, and the driver's hand moved toward his jacket. "Don't," Sheriff Daniels warned, his service weapon already drawn. "Hands where I can see them." For a tense moment, Ace thought they might risk a confrontation. Then, the third man called from inside the truck, "Easy, boys, another time." The Texas accent was thicker, the voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to giving orders. Slowly, deliberately, both men raised their hands, their expressions now carefully blank. "Just a mixed-up delivery, like we said," the driver insisted. "No need for guns, Sheriff." "Then you won't mind if I run your plates and IDs," Daniels replied. "Standard procedure." "Actually, we're running behind on deliveries," the voice from inside the truck called out. "Rain check on the paperwork, Sheriff. We'll sort this out with the office." The sheriff kept his weapon trained on them as they climbed back into the truck. As they pulled away, Ace memorized every detail of the vehicle and its occupants. His mind automatically cataloging distinctive features the way he had done for years when tracking fugitives. "Want me to stop them?" Tom asked, already reaching for his radio. Ace shook his head. "On what grounds? They haven't done anything illegal yet. Better to let them think their cover story worked and we're just being cautious." He smiled grimly. "Besides, they'll be back, and next time we'll be ready." After the sheriff departed, Ace gathered his ranch hands at the main house. The mood was tense as he explained what had happened. "So they've already got eyes on the place, and now they're bold enough to drive right up to the front door?" Jamie asked, his hand unconsciously checking the revolver on his hip. "They're establishing a complete operational picture," Ace explained. "Surveillance gives them the layout and routines, but they need to see the central area up close. Security systems, number of personnel, access points to buildings." Mike, the oldest of the hands, spat into an empty coffee can he kept for the purpose. "Sounds like they're planning to clean us out, boss." "That's exactly what they're planning," Ace confirmed, "but it also confirms something important. They don't know who they're dealing with." He unfolded a map of the ranch across the kitchen table. "Ryan, how's the movement of the prime stock?" "Incoming. First group's already in the Box Canyon. Second group moves at dawn. We'll have all 36 prize animals secured by tomorrow noon." Ace nodded approvingly. "Good. Now, here's what happens next. We modify our visible security just enough to make them work for it, but not enough to scare them off completely. Motion sensors at the main approaches, extra padlocks on the barns, regular patrols. The kind of precautions any concerned rancher might take after hearing about nearby thefts." Sam, the youngest hand, looked confused. "Shouldn't we be making it impossible for them to get in? Why leave any opening at all?" Ace fixed him with a steady gaze. "Because I don't just want to prevent a theft, Sam. I want to catch the people responsible." His finger traced a pattern across the map. They've hit at least a dozen ranches across 3 states. If we simply fortify Evergreen, they'll move on to another target, maybe the Wilcox place with that young family, or Old Man Hargrove, who's too stubborn to upgrade his security. Understanding dawned on the men's faces. This wasn't just about protecting Evergreen Ranch. It was about ending the threat to the entire community. We're going to set a trap, Ace continued, but it has to be subtle. They need to think they've identified our security measures and found a way around them. That means presenting a believable vulnerability while actually controlling the entire engagement. As night fell over Evergreen Ranch, Ace stood on the porch of the main house, watching as Ryan and Jamie installed the visible security measures. Motion-activated lights, new locks, and trail cameras placed where they would be spotted by observant intruders. Meanwhile, Mike and Sam were installing the real security grid. Pressure sensors buried under access roads, infrared tripwires concealed in natural choke points, and cellular alarms that would silently alert Ace to any intrusion. The ranch appeared to be battening down against a potential threat, taking logical but limited precautions. Only someone with Ace's background would recognize that the visible security was actually part of a carefully crafted illusion, a stage being set for uninvited visitors. After the men retired to the bunkhouse, Ace retreated to a room few people knew existed. Behind a bookcase in his study lay a small command center, a relic of his days in the Marshal's Special Operations Group. Here, monitors displayed feeds from hidden cameras covering key approaches to the ranch, while a specialized radio system allowed him to monitor local communications without detection. He hadn't used this equipment in years, but he'd maintained it meticulously, another habit from his previous life. Old instincts were surfacing now, skills and awareness he'd deliberately suppressed during his years as just a rancher. His satellite phone, a secure line kept for emergencies, chimed softly. The number was blocked, but Ace knew who it would. "B. Reynolds," he answered. "Heard you had some unwelcome visitors today." The voice belonged to Marcus Trent, Ace's former partner in the Marshal Service and now regional director for the FBI's Helena office. "News travels fast. Tom Daniels called me directly. Thought I should know, given our history." A pause. "These cattle thefts aren't just local problems, Ace. We're looking at a multi-state operation with potential connections to organized crime. The animals are just the visible part. We suspect money laundering, possibly even links to cross-border smuggling operations." Ace absorbed this information silently. It aligned with his own assessment of the professionalism he'd witnessed. "The FBI team arriving tomorrow," he said finally. "They know what they're walking into." "They think they do," Marcus replied, a hint of frustration in his voice. "Young agent named Cortez. Good credentials but limited field experience with rural operations. By the time she builds a case file and gets approval for proper resources, the thieves will be long gone," Ace finished for him. "Exactly, which is why I'm calling. Whatever you're planning, and I know you well enough to know you're planning something, just be careful. These aren't regular rustlers. The intelligence suggests a former military, possibly with ties to private security contractors who went mercenary." Noted. Ace's tone revealed nothing of his thoughts, a habit developed over decades of high-stakes operations. "One more thing," Marcus added. "Name that keeps coming up in our investigation, Carson Wade. Mean anything to you?" Ace's grip tightened imperceptibly on the phone. Carson Wade. He hadn't heard that name in 7 years, not since his final case, with the Marshal Service, a fugitive apprehension that had gone sideways, resulting in 3 deaths and Wade escaping into the wind. "Might ring a bell," he said carefully. "You have confirmation he's involved?" "Nothing solid yet. Just chatter from informants, but enough mentions to flag in our system." Marcus's voice took on an edge of concern. If it is Wade, Ace, this changes the equation. You know what he's capable of. After ending the call, Ace sat motionless in the darkened command center, memories surfacing that he'd long tried to suppress. Carson Wade had been a rising star in the private military contractor world before evidence emerged linking him to arms trafficking and murder for hire. Ace had been assigned to bring him in, tracking Wade across 5 states in a manhunt that culminated in a bloody standoff at an abandoned ranch not unlike Evergreen. Wade had escaped, but not before killing 2 local deputies and a federal agent. The official manhunt had eventually been scaled back as other priorities emerged, but Ace had never forgotten the case, or the man who got away. If Wade was involved with the cattle rustling operation, it explained the military-grade equipment and tactical precision. It also significantly raised the stakes. This wasn't just about stealing livestock anymore, it was personal. Moving to the gun safe concealed behind a false panel, Ace unlocked it and surveyed the contents. Beyond his everyday ranch weapons lay tools he'd hoped never to need again. Specialized equipment from his marshal's days that had somehow never made it back to the federal armory when he retired. He selected several items with deliberate care, checking each one with the methodical attention of someone whose life had once depended on such equipment functioning flawlessly. If Carson Wade was behind the operation targeting Evergreen Ranch, standard precautions wouldn't be sufficient. The night deepened as Ace continued his preparations, the ranch quiet except for the occasional lowing of cattle and the distant howl of coyotes. Tomorrow he would need to accelerate his plans, but tonight he allowed himself to process the implications of Wade's potential involvement. The rustlers targeting ranches throughout the area weren't just thieves, they were professional operators, with military training and potentially a personal vendetta against the owner of Evergreen Ranch. They had no idea they were planning to rob a former U.S. Marshal who had once been considered the best manhunter in the service. More importantly, they had no idea they were about to confront the only man who had ever come close to capturing Carson Wade. Dawn was still hours away as Ace stepped onto the porch, Cutter at his side. The Montana night spread a canopy of stars. Across the sky, the Milky Way, a luminous river overhead. He took a deep breath, allowing the crisp mountain air to clear his mind. The peaceful ranch he'd built as a refuge from his former life was about to become a battleground. But unlike 7 years ago, when Carson Wade had escaped, this time Ace would be fighting on his own terms, on his own ground. The rustlers might think they were targeting an ordinary ranch owned by a regular cowboy. They were about to discover how wrong they were, and why Mason Ace Reynolds had earned his legendary reputation in the first place. The following morning dawned crisp and clear over Evergreen Ranch, the kind of perfect autumn day that reminded Ace why he'd chosen Montana for his retirement. But as he drove his weathered Ford F-250 into the town of Clearwater, his mind wasn't on the stunning landscape or golden aspen leaves. The revelation about Carson Wade's possible involvement had changed the entire complexion of the situation. Clearwater was the kind of small western town that seemed frozen in time, a main street lined with historic brick buildings, a courthouse square with a Civil War monument, and local businesses that had been run by the same families for generations. It served as the commercial hub for the surrounding ranches, a place where neighbors caught up on local news and ranch hands blew off steam on Saturday nights. Ace parked in front of Maggie's Diner, a local institution housed in a converted train car with additional seating built onto the back. The breakfast crowd was in full swing, the rich aromas of coffee, bacon, and Maggie's famous sourdough pancakes filling the air. The bell over the door jingled as he entered, and several patrons nodded in greeting. Ace wasn't one for small talk, but over 7 years he'd become a familiar presence in town, Quiet, respectful, and known to help neighbors in need without making a fuss about it. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Maggie called from behind the counter, already reaching for the coffee pot. At 63, she moved with the energy of someone 20 years younger, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Your usual table's open." Ace took his seat by the window, a position that gave him a clear view of both the entrance and the street outside, another habit from his previous life. Maggie brought his coffee without being asked, setting it down alongside a menu he wouldn't need. "Heard about Davidson's place," she said, lowering her voice. "Jim was in here yesterday. Looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Those animals represented his retirement plans." "Have any strangers been through town the past few days?" Ace asked, scanning the diner's other patrons. Maggie's eyes narrowed slightly. "Matter of fact, yes. Group of men in a black Suburban stopped for lunch 2 days ago. Didn't talk much, but they were asking about local ranches, particularly ones specializing in premium stock." She paused, studying his face. "Something you're not telling me, Mason Reynolds." Despite his reserved nature, Ace had developed a respectful relationship with Maggie over the years. She reminded him of his mother, perceptive, no nonsense, and impossible to fool. "Just connecting some dots," he replied, taking a sip of coffee. "Did they mention Evergreen specifically?" "Not directly, but one asked if I knew the owner of that big spread with the prize Angus operation. Said he might be interested in buying breeding stock." Maggie snorted. "Told him the owner wasn't selling, but I had a feeling they already knew that." The bell over the door jingled again, and Ace glanced up to see Beth Wilson entering. As the local veterinarian, Beth handled medical care for livestock throughout the county, making her one of the few people who regularly visited most ranches. She spotted Ace and made her way over, her expression concerned. "Morning, Ace," she greeted, sliding into the booth across from him without invitation. At 35, Beth had returned to her hometown after veterinary school, taking over her father's practice. Her light brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the practical clothes of someone who might be called out to birth a calf at any moment. "Been trying to reach you. Thought I'd find you here." "Problem?" he asked, noting the tension in her shoulders. "Maybe." She leaned forward, keeping her voice low. "I've been tracking these cattle thefts, looking for patterns. Every ranch that's been hit had a visit from me within the previous month for routine vaccinations or health certificates." Ace considered this information. "You think someone's using your schedule to identify targets?" "I think someone might be accessing my client records somehow. The timing's too perfect." Her expression clouded. "The thought that someone might be using my practice to target ranchers makes me sick." "Your computer system secure?" Beth hesitated. "Should be, but I'm not exactly an IT expert. Dad's old record system was all paper. I'm the one who digitized everything when I took over." Maggie appeared with Ace's usual breakfast, 2 eggs over medium, sourdough toast, and hash browns. She set a coffee in front of Beth without being asked. "You two look serious this morning," Maggie observed. "Something I should know about." Beth glanced around the diner, then back at Maggie. "Actually, there might be. Have you noticed anyone hanging around town, maybe asking questions about local ranches, their operations, and valuable livestock?" "I was just telling Ace about some men in a black Suburban," Maggie confirmed. "They weren't the only ones, though. Had a fellow last week claiming to be writing an article on premium cattle operations for some agricultural magazine. Asked a lot of questions about which ranches had the best breeding stock." The three exchanged significant looks. Information. Gathering from multiple angles, professional reconnaissance combined with intelligence collection from local sources. "Let me check something," Beth said, pulling out her phone and opening a calendar app. "Davidson's place was hit 2 days ago. I was there exactly 17 days before that for pregnancy checks on his heifers." She scrolled further. "Russell's place Hit 3 weeks ago. I was there 10 days before. Her face paled slightly. And I was at Evergreen 8 days ago. Ace's jaw tightened. If the pattern held, that put his ranch squarely in the crosshairs for an imminent hit. "When's the FBI agent supposed to arrive?" Beth asked. "Today, according to Sheriff Daniels." Ace took a bite of his breakfast, mind working through the implications. "But like I told Tom, by the time the feds assemble enough evidence for a proper operation, these rustlers will have moved on to new territory." The diner's door opened again, and all three turned to see Will Hargrove enter. At 78, Will was the oldest active rancher in the county, still running the operation his grandfather had established in 1889. His weathered face bore the marks of decades under the Montana sun, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. Spotting their group, he made his way over, leaning heavily on a handmade walking stick. "Morning, folks," he greeted, tipping his worn Stetson. "Ace, got a minute?" Maggie brought another cup of coffee without being asked, and Will eased himself into the booth beside Beth, groaning slightly as his arthritic joints protested. "Saw some unusual activity by my north fence line yesterday evening," he said without preamble. "Two men with binoculars staying just off my property. When my grandson rode out to investigate, they claimed to be birdwatchers." He snorted. "Birdwatchers with military haircuts and tactical boots." Ace exchanged glances with Beth and Maggie. The pattern was expanding, more ranches being surveyed, more intelligence being gathered. The operation targeting local ranches was thorough and professional. "Have you upgraded your security recently?" Ace asked. The old rancher shook his head. "Same setup my daddy used. Good fences, good dogs, and a loaded shotgun by the door." He fixed Ace with a knowing look. "But I'm thinking maybe it's time for some modern improvements, given what happened to Jim Davidson and the others." "Might be wise," Ace agreed. Beth was just sharing some concerns about how these rustlers might be targeting specific operations. Will turned to the veterinarian. "Something to do with your client records?" Beth nodded, surprised. "How did you know?" "Been ranching for 60 years, girl. You learn to spot patterns." He sipped his coffee. "Every hit has been a place with premium stock, and you're one of the few people who regularly visits all those operations. Wasn't hard to put together." The conversation paused as the diner's door opened once more. A woman in her mid-30s entered, her crisp pantsuit and alert demeanor immediately setting her apart from the locals. Her dark hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and she scanned the room with an assessing gaze that Ace recognized from his own law enforcement days. $10 says that's our FBI agent," Maggie murmured. Ace nodded slightly. "Special Agent Cortez, if I had to guess." The woman spotted Sheriff Daniels at the counter and approached him. After a brief conversation, both turned and headed toward Ace's table. "Morning, all," Sheriff Daniels greeted. "This is Special Agent Elena Cortez from the FBI's Helena office. Agent Cortez, this is Dr. Beth Wilson, our local veterinarian. Will Hargrove, who runs the oldest ranch in the county. Maggie Sinclair, who knows everything worth knowing around here, and Mason Reynolds of Evergreen Ranch." Agent Cortez nodded professionally to each of them, her gaze lingering a moment longer on Ace. "Mr. Reynolds, Sheriff Daniels tells me you've had suspicious activity on your property recently." "That's right," Ace confirmed, offering no additional information. Years in law enforcement had taught him to measure his words carefully with federal agents he didn't know personally. The agent seemed to sense his reservation. "Sheriff, is there somewhere we could speak more privately?" "We can use my office at the clinic," Beth offered. "It's just down the street, and I have documentation of all the ranches that have been hit, along with my visit schedules." 20 minutes later, they were seated in Beth's comfortable office at the Clearwater Veterinary Clinic. The wood-paneled room was filled with both modern veterinary texts and old volumes that had belonged to Beth's father. creating an atmosphere that balanced tradition with progress. "I'll be direct," Agent Cortez began, setting a slim laptop on the desk. "We believe these cattle thefts are part of a larger criminal enterprise operating across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. The targets are specifically high-value breeding stock, particularly registered Black Angus with superior genetics." She opened her computer and turned it to show a map with red markers indicating theft locations across the 3 states. The pattern suggests detailed knowledge of ranch operations, security measures, and most importantly, the value of specific animals. "That's where Beth's records might come in," Sheriff Daniels explained. "She was just telling us every ranch that's been hit had a visit from her within the previous month." Agent Cortez turned to Beth. "Dr. Wilson, when you visit these ranches, what kind of information do you document?" "Everything," Beth replied. "Health records for individual animals, genetic information, pregnancy status, vaccination schedules, anything that affects their health or value. For prize breeding stock, I maintain detailed records that include estimated market value for insurance purposes." "And these records are digitized?" Beth nodded. "Converted everything to digital about 3 years ago. The system connects to a cloud server, so I can access records from my truck at remote locations." The FBI agent made a note. "We'll need to examine your system for potential security breaches. The level of targeting suggests the thieves have access to specific information about which animals are most valuable." Ace, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "These rustlers aren't just after random cattle, they're cherry-picking the most valuable animals with surgical precision that requires insider knowledge." Agent Cortez studied him with new interest. "You seem to have given this considerable thought, Mr. Reynolds." "It's my livelihood at stake," he replied simply. Hargrove cleared his throat. "There's something else you should know, Agent Cortez. Most of us around here are regular ranchers, experienced with cattle, but not with sophisticated security. Ace here is different." The FBI agent raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Before anyone could respond, Beth's clinic phone rang. She answered, listened briefly, then covered the mouthpiece. "It's Mike Thornton from Evergreen. Says it's urgent." Ace took the phone. "What is it, Mike?" His expression tightened as he listened. "When? Keep your distance, but maintain visual contact if possible. I'm heading back now." He handed the phone back to Beth. "Someone cut the fence on the east pasture. Ryan spotted 2 men on ATVs, herding a small group of cattle toward the county road. Sheriff Daniels was already on his feet. Could be a diversion to draw attention away from a larger operation." "My thoughts exactly," Ace agreed. "They're testing responses, seeing how quickly we react, and with what resources." He turned to Agent Cortez. "If you want to see these rustlers in action firsthand, I'd suggest coming along." The agent seemed momentarily taken aback by his assertiveness, but recovered quickly. "I'll follow in my vehicle. Sheriff, will you coordinate with local deputies?" As they moved toward the door, Will Hargrove caught Ace's arm. "Son, be careful. Old-timers like me recognize when someone's setting a trap. Maybe they know exactly who you are and they're trying to draw you out." Ace nodded, understanding the old rancher's concern. "Appreciate the warning, Will, but if they know who I am, they should be the ones worried, not me." Outside, Ace climbed into his truck while Sheriff Daniels radioed for backup. Agent Cortez approached before he could start the engine. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her tone more measured than before. "Something tells me there's more to your background than local rancher. Care to fill me in before we walk into whatever's happening?" Ace assessed her quickly, competent, professional, but new to this type of rural operation. She deserved to know what she might be facing. "I was with the U.S. Marshal Service for 23 years, he said quietly. "Special Operations Group. Fugitive apprehension in high-risk environments." Her eyes widened slightly. "That's not in Your file. Most of my record is redacted for security reasons. He started the truck. One more thing you should know. I have reason to believe Carson Wade might be involved in this operation. The color drained from Agent Cortez's face. Carson Wade? The same Wade who... The same, Ace confirmed grimly. I nearly caught him 7 years ago. It was my last case before retirement. That explains a lot, she said, her demeanor shifting from professional curiosity to focused alertness. I'll call for additional resources from Helena. Won't get here in time, Ace replied. If it is Wade, he's already made his move. This fence cutting is just the opening gambit. Then we need a plan, Cortez insisted. Ace's expression hardened slightly. I've got one, but it requires understanding. That we're not dealing with ordinary cattle thieves. These are trained operators with military backgrounds and high-end equipment. All the more reason to wait for proper backup, she argued. All the more reason not to, Ace countered. Wade doesn't wait. He executes with precision, then disappears before conventional responses can mobilize. If we don't move now, we lose. The initiative. The professional standoff lasted only seconds before Agent Cortez nodded reluctantly. I'll follow your lead, for now. But I want a full briefing on your history with Wade once this immediate situation is resolved. Fair enough, Ace agreed, putting the truck in gear. As they pulled away from the clinic, Beth Wilson and Will Hargrove watched from the doorway, concern evident on their faces. The drive back to Evergreen Ranch took 15 minutes, with Sheriff Daniels and Agent Cortez following close behind. Ace used the time to call Ryan and get an update on the situation. They took 6 yearling heifers, Ryan reported. Not our primary breeding stock, but good animals worth about $12,000 altogether. Jamie and I are tracking them from a distance. They're moving the cattle along the old logging road toward Blackwater Creek. Stay back, Ace instructed. They're likely expecting pursuit. This could be bait for a larger trap. Already figured. Do that, Ryan replied, and Ace could hear the pride in his foreman's voice at anticipating the tactical situation. We split up, Jamie's monitoring from the ridge with binoculars, while I circle wide to cut off their potential escape routes. Ace smiled slightly. His training of the ranch hands was paying off. Good thinking. Any sign of additional personnel? Or vehicles? Nothing yet, but there's a spot about 2 miles ahead where the logging road passes through a narrow ravine. Perfect place for an ambush if someone was thinking that way. They are, Ace assured him. Keep your distance and maintain communication. Sheriff Daniels and an FBI agent are with me. We'll approach from the main road. As they created the final hill before Evergreen Ranch, Ace could see his property spread. Out below, the eastern fence line showed clear signs of disturbance, with cattle still milling around the breach. In the distance, a dust cloud marked the progress of vehicles moving across the rangeland. Sheriff Daniels pulled alongside at the ranch entrance. What's your plan, Ace? My deputies are still 15 minutes out. We need to approach from multiple angles, Ace replied. This is almost certainly a diversion to test our response patterns while they prepare for the main operation. Agent Cortez joined them, her bureau SUV kicking up dust as she parked. If Wade is running this, he's gathering intelligence on response times, routes and personnel. Standard tactical assessment before a major operation. Ace nodded, recognizing the professional assessment, which means we feed him misleading information. Sheriff, can your deputies approach from the south, making no attempt at concealment? I want them visible, creating the impression that's our main response vector. While we do what? Cortez asked. We go in quietly from the north, Ace explained. Not to engage, but to observe. If this is Wade's operation, he'll have observation posts monitoring all of this. I want to identify those positions. The sheriff considered this approach. Basically, we're conducting counter-surveillance on their surveillance. Exactly, Ace confirmed. Agent Cortez, with your permission, I'd suggest we coordinate with my ranch hands who are already in position. They know this terrain intimately. The FBI agent seemed momentarily torn between protocol and pragmatism. "Officially, I should keep civilians out of a federal investigation," she said finally. "Unofficially, we need the local knowledge. I'll authorize temporary deputization through Sheriff Daniels if needed." Ace nodded appreciatively. Cortez was adapting quickly to the realities of rural operations, where federal resources were limited and local expertise essential. As they prepared to move out, Will Hargrove's ancient pickup truck came bouncing up the ranch road, the old rancher. Driving with surprising speed for his age, he pulled up beside them, rolling down his window. "Thought you might want to know," he called out. "Just got word from Ted Burkett, who runs the Paradise Valley Ranch south of here. His south fence was cut about an hour ago. The same pattern. 8 heads of premium Angus are missing." Ace exchanged glances with Sheriff Daniels and Agent Cortez. The picture was becoming clearer. Multiple distractions to divide law enforcement resources while gathering intelligence on response patterns. "They're hitting multiple locations simultaneously," Cortez observed. "Classic tactic to stretch defensive. Resources thin, which means this isn't just about stealing a few cattle," Ace added. "It's reconnaissance for something bigger." Will Hargrove's weathered face creased with concern. "Reminds me of stories my granddaddy told about the Johnson County War. Professional operators using cattle as an excuse for something that had nothing to do with ranching. The old ranchers." Historical reference wasn't lost on Ace. The infamous range war had been about power and control, not livestock. If Carson Wade was using cattle rustling as cover for a larger operation, the stakes were potentially much higher than anyone had realized. As they formulated their response plan, Ace reflected on how quickly the peaceful community of Clearwater had mobilized in the face of threat. From Maggie's intelligence gathering at the diner to Beth's recognition of the pattern in her veterinary records to Will's historical perspective and connections with other ranchers, each had contributed. Crucial pieces to understanding what they were facing. "Let me bring up something else," Beth said, approaching Ace's truck with her tablet in hand. "I've been tracking bloodlines in the premium Angus operations across the country. Every ranch that's been hit has animals with direct lineage to a champion bull named Midnight Emperor." Agent Cortez looked up with interest. "Why would that matter?" "Because those genetics are gold in the breeding world," Beth explained. "Animals with that bloodline sell for 3 to 5 times the normal market value. More importantly, there's an international market for their genetic material. Semen from top bulls can go for thousands of dollars per unit." Will Hargrove nodded knowingly. "And those genetics can be transported across borders with minimal inspection. Unlike live animals." The realization clicked for everyone simultaneously. This wasn't just about stealing cattle. It was about targeting specific genetic lines that could be leveraged internationally, possibly through illegal channels. "Do your animals at Evergreen have this bloodline?" Agent Cortez asked Ace. 36 of my prime breeding animals trace back to Midnight Emperor," he confirmed grimly, "including my main herd sire, Black Thunder, who's a direct son." Beth's eyes widened. "Black Thunder is probably the most valuable bull in the 3 states, right? Now, his genetic material alone could be worth $500,000 on the international market. And a live animal that could continue producing that genetic material would be priceless," Sheriff Daniels added, understanding the dawning on his face. Agent Cortez turned to Ace. "You moved your prime breeding stock recently, didn't you?" Ace nodded. "To the Box Canyon beyond Miller's Creek. It's defensible, has water, and isn't on any public maps. Ryan and the boys completed the move yesterday." "Smart move," Cortez acknowledged. "But if Wade is running this operation, he'll have contingencies for missing animals. He'll find them eventually." "I'm counting on it," Ace replied, his voice carrying a quiet confidence that made everyone look at him. The difference is, when he comes for them, it'll be on my terms, not his. The group was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle approaching, a battered blue pickup belonging to Frank Wilcox, who ran a smaller ranch on the eastern edge of the county. Frank was in his 40s, a second-generation rancher who'd expanded the operation his father had started. He pulled up beside Will's truck, his expression tense. "Heard about the fence cutting on the radio," Frank said, not bothering with greetings. "Just wanted to let you know I spotted 2 men on horseback scouting my north boundary yesterday. Thought they were hands from the neighboring spread until I called over there and found out none of their people were in that area." Sheriff Daniels pulled out a county map. "So we've got confirmed activity at Evergreen, Paradise Valley, and now possibly Wilcox Ranch, plus the previous hits at Davidson's and Russell's places." He marked each location with a pen. "They're working their way systematically across the county, hitting the operations with the most valuable stock." "But why cut fences and take just a few animals from each place?" Beth wondered. "If they're after the prime breeding stock, why bother with yearling heifers?" "Because it's not just about the cattle," Ace explained, seeing the pattern clearly. "Now, it's about mapping law enforcement response patterns and identifying security measures. Each small theft gives them valuable intelligence for the main operation." "Classic reconnaissance by fire," Agent Cortez agreed. "They're prodding defenses, drawing out responses and documenting everything." Frank Wilcox looked between them, confusion evident on his face. "You're talking like this is some kind of military operation, not cattle rustling." "Because that's exactly what it is," Will Hargrove said with the authority of his many decades of experience. "These aren't ordinary thieves. They're professionals with a specific objective." Maggie's ancient station wagon appeared on the ranch road, the diner owner driving with surprising speed. She pulled up to the growing collection of vehicles, a cardboard box on the seat beside her. "Thought you all might need sustenance," she announced, opening the box to reveal thermoses of coffee and wrapped sandwiches. "And information. 2 more strangers came into the diner right after you left, claiming to be livestock buyers, but asking all the wrong questions." She handed coffees around. "When I mentioned that the sheriff was meeting with an FBI agent about the cattle thefts, they couldn't leave fast enough." "Description?" Sheriff Daniels asked. "Mid-30s, military haircuts, one with a Texas drawl, one with what sounded like a Carolina accent, driving a dark blue Ford F-250, newish model, out-of-state plates." Maggie's sharp eyes had missed nothing. The Texan had a scar along his jaw, and the other one had a Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm. Neither ate much of the food they ordered, and they kept checking their phones like they were waiting for something. Agent Cortez looked impressed. "That's a remarkably detailed observation, Ms. Sinclair," Maggie shrugged. 30 years running a diner, you learn to read people. Those 2 weren't livestock buyers. They were soldiers trying to play a part." Ace nodded his agreement. The description of the men matched what he would expect from Wade's operation, former military personnel with specialized skills repurposed for criminal enterprises, the kind of men who might look ordinary to most observers, but stood out to those with the right experience. "There's something else," Maggie added, lowering her voice despite the fact they were well away from any potential eavesdroppers. Jenny overheard them talking when she was refilling their water glasses. One of them mentioned something about the real prize being in the safe, not the pasture. The group exchanged puzzled glances. "What safe?" Beth asked. "That's just it," Maggie continued. There was no context, just that cryptic comment. Ace's mind raced through the possibilities. If Wade was involved, this operation might have multiple objectives beyond simply stealing valuable livestock. During their previous encounter 7 years ago, Wade had been trafficking in more than just arms. There had been evidence suggesting involvement in document fraud, money laundering, and even intelligence gathering for foreign interests. What if the cattle operation was just cover for something else entirely? "Sheriff," Ace said quietly. Who in the county would have a safe that might interest professional thieves, besides the obvious, like banks and jewelry stores? Tom Daniels thought for a moment. County Clerk's office has one for vital records and certain historical documents. The museum in Helena has a small satellite location here with some valuable artifacts. Oh, and Judge Hawkins maintains a secure room for sensitive case files in the courthouse basement. None of these seemed like likely targets for men of Wade's caliber. They specialized in high-value objectives with significant payoffs, not small-town record-keeping. Unless the research facility, Ace said suddenly, the pieces clicking into place. Clearwater Agricultural Research Station on the north edge of town. They do genetic research and storage for livestock breeding programs across the Northwest. Beth's eyes widened in understanding. Including cryogenic storage of genetic material from champion bloodlines. They have samples from some of the most valuable bull lines in the country, including complete collections from animals that are no longer living. A genetic library that would be worth millions to the right buyers, Agent Cortez concluded. And far easier to transport across borders than live animals. The picture was becoming clearer now. The cattle thefts weren't just about stealing valuable animals. They were gathering intelligence on local law enforcement capabilities while simultaneously creating a distraction from the main objective, the genetic repository at the research station. We need to warn them, Sheriff Daniels said, reaching for his radio. Wait, Ace cautioned. If we alert them now, Wade will know we've figured out his plan. Our best advantage is that he doesn't realize what we know. Agent Cortez nodded in agreement. He's right. We should heighten security discreetly while maintaining the appearance that we're focused solely on cattle thefts. The tension in the group was palpable as they realized the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about protecting Evergreen Ranch or even the county's valuable livestock. It was about preventing a sophisticated heist that could have repercussions for the entire agricultural industry. Frank Wilcox, who had been listening intently, cleared his throat. So, what's the plan? We can't just sit back and let these people steal from our community. We don't, Ace assured him. But we need to be smart about how we respond. These men are professionals. They'll be watching for conventional law enforcement reactions and planning accordingly. What we need, Will Hargrove said thoughtfully, is to give them exactly what they expect to see while doing something completely different behind the scenes. The old rancher might be pushing 80, but his strategic mind remained sharp. Agent Cortez looked at Ace. You've dealt with Wade before. What would he expect from local law enforcement in this situation? Predictable patrol patterns. Visible. Security increases at the locations that have already been hit. Conventional investigation methods. Ace leaned against his truck, arms crossed. What he wouldn't expect is a coordinated community response that anticipates his moves rather than reacting to them. Sheriff Daniels nodded slowly. So we make a show of increasing patrols along the usual routes, while actually focusing our resources elsewhere. Exactly, Ace confirmed. And we leverage what Wade doesn't know, that this community is more connected and observant than he realizes. As the impromptu strategy session continued, more vehicles arrived at Evergreen Ranch. Neighbors, fellow ranchers, and townspeople who had heard about the fence cutting and came to offer assistance. What had started as a law enforcement response was evolving into a community mobilization. Maggie organized the newcomers with the efficiency of someone used to managing a busy diner during the lunch rush. Ted, your boys know the backcountry better than anyone. I want you coordinating with Ace's hands on perimeter security. Sarah, get on the phone with your sister at the county dispatch. We need to know about any suspicious calls or reports. Henderson twins, you two take your horses and check the ridgelines. You know every trail and deer path in these mountains. Ace watched with quiet approval as the community self-organized, each person contributing their specific skills and knowledge. Wade might have military training and professional equipment, but he lacked what this community possessed in abundance: deep, local knowledge and the unshakable bonds of people who had known each other for generations. "I underestimated your community," Agent Cortez said quietly, stepping up beside Ace. "Most people do," he replied. "It's not obvious from the outside. But these people have been helping each other survive harsh winters and tough times for generations. They know how to pull together when threatened." Beth approached them, her expression troubled. "I've been thinking about my computer system. If someone hacked into my records to identify valuable animals, they'd also have access to the vaccination schedules and health records." "Why would that matter?" Agent Cortez asked. "Because they'd know exactly which animals had been treated with which medications and when." Beth's concern deepened, including which ones might have residual tranquilizers in their system from recent treatments. The implication was clear. The Rustlers weren't just selecting animals based on value, but also targeting those that might be easier to handle during theft due to recent medication. "Check your records," Ace instructed. "Let's see if there's a correlation between the stolen animals and recent treatments." As Beth pulled out her tablet and began reviewing her data, Sheriff Daniels approached with his radio in hand. "Just got word from my deputies. They're tracking the movement of those stolen heifers. They've been loaded into a stock trailer on the old mining road east of here." "Don't move in yet," Ace cautioned. "Let them think their diversion is working. We need to keep our focus on the bigger picture." The sheriff nodded, trusting Ace's judgment, despite the natural law enforcement instinct to pursue active criminals. Will Hargrove, who had been quietly observing the growing community response, stepped up to Ace with a knowing look in his rheumy eyes. "Been a while since you commanded an operation like this, hasn't it, son?" Ace glanced at the old rancher, surprised by his perception. "What makes you think I've commanded anything other than cattle drives, Will?" The old man chuckled softly. "You forget I served in Korea. Recognize a commander when I see one. It's in how people naturally follow your lead, without you having to raise your voice or pull rank." He gestured to the gathered community members who were instinctively looking to Ace for direction, despite the presence of both the sheriff and an FBI agent. That kind of respect isn't earned by just being a good rancher. Before Ace could respond, Ryan's voice came through on the ranch radio. "Boss, movement at the east. Fence line, 2 vehicles approaching from the county road. Looks like they're coming back for another look." The activity around the main ranch house immediately focused on this new development. Agent Cortez stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Could be Wade testing our response patterns." "Most likely," Ace agreed, "which gives us an opportunity to feed him misleading information." He turned to Sheriff Daniels. "Tom, make a show of sending your deputies to intercept. Lots of radio traffic, visible movement. I want them to think all our attention is focused eastward." The sheriff grinned. "Understanding the strategy, while we actually focus on the research facility," Ace finished. "Agent Cortez, can you contact them discreetly? Have them enhance security without making it obvious they've been warned." The FBI agent nodded, already reaching for her phone. "I'll handle it personally." As the various members of the community shifted into their roles in the emerging plan, Ace felt a familiar sensation he hadn't experienced in years, the focused clarity that came with commanding a complex operation. The Rustlers had made a crucial miscalculation in targeting this particular community and this particular ranch. They still had no idea they were dealing with a man who had spent his life hunting men just like them, and who was now marshalling an entire community to turn their own tactics against them. The Rustlers had made a critical error in targeting ranches in this community. They might have studied the livestock and security systems, but they had underestimated the human connections that bound these people together. More importantly, they remained ignorant of exactly who owned Evergreen Ranch and what Mason Ace Reynolds was capable of when protecting his home and community. 40 miles east of Evergreen Ranch, in an abandoned mining complex hidden among the foothills of the Little Belt Mountains, Carson Wade studied the digital map displayed on the wall-mounted screen. Red markers indicated ranches already hit, blue showed planned targets, and green highlighted their primary objective: the Clearwater Agricultural Research Station with its invaluable genetic repository. At 45, Wade cut an imposing figure. Despite his average height, his close-cropped salt-and-pepper hair and the jagged scar running along his jaw gave him a perpetually severe expression. But it was his eyes, pale grey and utterly devoid of warmth, that most people remembered. Those eyes had witnessed and orchestrated violence across 4 continents during his career as a military contractor, before he'd found more profitable applications for his skills. "Sir, we've got the live feed from Team 2, announced Derek Mercer, a former Army Ranger who served as Wade's second-in-command. Mercer tapped a keyboard, bringing up real-time video from the eastern boundary of Evergreen Ranch. "They're running the diversion now." Sheriff's deputies responded exactly as predicted. Wade studied the footage with clinical detachment. Response time: 11 minutes from call to arrival, consistent with previous patterns. "And our surveillance on the main ranch house?" Mercer switched feeds to show Ace's property, where community members and law enforcement appeared to be gathering in response to the fence cutting. "Significant activity. Looks like they're organizing search parties, probably to recover the stolen cattle." Wade leaned closer, something catching his attention. "Zoom in on that vehicle." The camera focused on a government-issue SUV parked among the ranch trucks. "Federal plates. Interesting. FBI, most likely," Mercer suggested. "Local authorities must have called them in after the pattern of thefts became obvious." "Expected but inconvenient," Wade mused. "Identify the agent if possible. We need to know what resources they're bringing to bear." As Mercer worked to get a better angle on the federal agent, Wade turned his attention to another screen showing livestock movement records for the county. The operation had been months in planning, identifying valuable breeding stock, mapping ranch security measures, establishing transport routes to move stolen animals through a network of falsified paperwork and compromised inspection points. The genetic material from these premium bloodlines would fetch millions on the international market, particularly in countries working to upgrade their domestic cattle industries without navigating the complex regulations governing live animal imports. But valuable as that objective was, it remained secondary to the true purpose of the operation. "Sir," called Lisa Reeves from her workstation. The former intelligence analyst had been monitoring communications throughout the county. "I've got something interesting." The sheriff just dispatched 2 deputies to the research station with instructions to conduct a routine security check without drawing attention. Wade's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Time from our diversion to this response?" 23 minutes, Reeves reported. "Too fast," Wade concluded. "They shouldn't have made that connection yet, not based on the information we've allowed to surface." He turned to study the personnel files displayed on a separate monitor. "Someone knows more than they should." "Who are we dealing with here?" The screen displayed records for local law enforcement, research facility staff, and prominent ranchers. Wade scrolled through them with growing impatience until he reached the file for Evergreen Ranch. The ownership records showed Mason Reynolds had purchased the property 7 years ago, with minimal background information available. "Get me everything on Reynolds," Wade instructed. "Military service, employment history, property records, anything that might explain why he's 1 step ahead of our timeline." Already working on it, Mercer replied, typing rapidly. Most of his background is surprisingly thin. Basic records show he moved here from Wyoming, purchased the ranch with cash, and has kept to himself while building a reputation for quality. Stock. He paused, frowning at his screen. That's odd. What? I'm trying to access his previous employment records and hitting redacted files. Government-level security protocols. Mercer looked up. This guy isn't just some rancher. Wade felt a stirring of unease. Operations like this succeeded through meticulous intelligence gathering and precise execution. Unknown variables increased risk exponentially. Keep digging. Use our contacts in federal records. Across the room, the communications specialist raised her hand. Sir, we've got movement at the research facility. They're bringing in additional security personnel, but keeping them unmarked. Plain clothes, civilian vehicles. Wade processed this information with growing concern. The operation had been compromised somehow, their primary objective now on alert. Yet the response wasn't what he would expect from typical law enforcement. No visible police presence, no evacuation protocols, just discreet reinforcement. Someone was playing a more sophisticated game than the local sheriff should be capable of orchestrating. Pull up the surveillance photos of the community meeting at Reynolds Ranch, Wade instructed, the wall screen filled with high-resolution images captured by their long-range surveillance equipment. He studied each face carefully until he froze. On one particular image, Ace, standing beside Sheriff Daniels, his posture and positioning revealing more to Wade's trained eye than most would notice. Enhance this, he ordered, pointing to Ace's face. As the image sharpened, Wade felt a jolt of recognition. The face had aged, but the eyes, those were unmistakable. Son of a bitch! You know him? Mercer asked. Mason Ace Reynolds, Wade said, the name clearly carrying weight. Though when I knew him, he was Chief Deputy U.S. Marshal Reynolds, Special Operations Group. A cold smile touched his lips. The man who nearly caught me in Idaho 7 years ago. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't dealing with a simple rancher, but a highly trained federal manhunter who had specialized in apprehending the most dangerous fugitives in the country. This changes things, Mercer observed quietly. It changes nothing, Wade countered, though his tone lacked conviction. It just means we need to accelerate our timeline and adjust our approach. He turned to the assembled team. Reynolds knows how we operate. He'll be anticipating our standard protocols, looking for the patterns he's familiar with. Should we abort? Asked Reeves cautiously. Wade's expression hardened. Absolutely not. The biological material in that research facility is worth millions, and we've invested too much to walk away. He paused, considering. But we do need to adapt. If Reynolds is involved, he'll be looking for me to run my usual playbook. So we give him something unexpected, Mercer suggested. Precisely. Wade moved to the central planning table where a detailed model of the county sat. We've been operating under the assumption that law enforcement resources would be stretched, thin by our diversionary cattle thefts, creating an opening for the main heist. Reynolds will have figured that out by now. He began moving markers around the model, reorganizing their planned approach. Instead, we'll stage what appears to be our main move on the research facility tonight. Enough personnel and equipment to look convincing, but ultimately a feint. While our actual objective is, Mercer prompted. Wade's smile was cold. Personal. Reynolds cost me a great deal 7 years ago. I think it's time to return the favor. He pointed to Evergreen Ranch on the model. Our intelligence shows he's moved his most valuable breeding stock to this remote canyon on his property. We'll hit that simultaneously with the research facility diversion. The bulls are valuable, Reeves acknowledged, but nothing compared to the genetic repository. This isn't about money, Wade clarified, his voice taking on an edge that made his team exchange glances. It's about sending a message. Reynolds took something from me in Idaho. Now I'm going to take something from him. Mercer studied the plan with professional detachment. He'll have the canyon secured, probably expecting us to make a play for it. Counting on it, Wade agreed, which is why neither the research facility nor the canyon is our actual target for tonight. He moved another marker on the model. We hit his main ranch house instead. Intelligence, equipment, personal items, anything that gives us leverage. The team processed this revision silently. They were professionals accustomed to adapting to changing circumstances, but the personal element Wade was introducing created unpredictable variables. Sir, Mercer said carefully, with respect, allowing personal history to influence operational planning increases risk. Wade fixed him with a cold stare. Your concern is noted, but Reynolds isn't just a complication, he's a specific threat with intimate knowledge of how we operate. Neutralizing him isn't personal, it's tactical necessity. No one in the room believed this justification, but none dared challenge it directly. Wade's mental stability had been a growing concern among his inner circle in recent months. The calculated professional they had followed had been showing increasingly erratic tendencies, particularly when dealing with perceived personal slights. Prepare 3 teams, Wade continued, apparently oblivious to their reservations. Alpha will create the diversion at the research facility, enough personnel and firepower to be convincing, but with clear exit strategies. Beta will approach the canyon as if preparing for a livestock raid, but will withdraw at the first sign of resistance. Meanwhile, the Gamma team, which I'll lead personally, will infiltrate the main ranch house. The detailed planning continued for another hour, with Wade growing more animated as he outlined each component of the operation. What had begun as a carefully orchestrated heist targeting valuable genetic material was evolving into something more complex and potentially more volatile, a personal vendetta masked as a tactical necessity. Communication discipline will be essential, Wade emphasized as they concluded. Reynolds knows our standard protocols, so we'll operate with minimal radio traffic, cell phones off, satellite comms only when absolutely necessary. As the team dispersed to prepare, Mercer lingered behind. Carson, he said quietly, using Wade's first name, something he rarely did. Are you sure about this? Going after Reynolds directly escalates this beyond asset acquisition. Wade's expression remained impassive, but something dangerous flickered in his pale eyes. You weren't there in Idaho, Derek. You didn't see what he took from me. I've read the files, Mercer countered. He was doing his job, just like we were doing ours. He crossed a line, Wade hissed, emotion finally cracking his composed exterior. He didn't just chase me, he dismantled everything I'd built. Frozen accounts, compromised contacts, destroyed evidence. His hand unconsciously moved to the scar on his jaw. And this was his parting gift. Mercer had never heard the full story of Wade's final encounter with Reynolds, but the intensity of his reaction was concerning. Just remember the objective. We're here for the payoff, not revenge. Wade's expression smoothed over, the momentary loss of control carefully buried beneath his professional demeanor. The objective remains unchanged. The genetic material is still our primary target. He picked up a file folder, effectively ending the conversation. Brief your team leaders. We move at 2200 hours. As Mercer departed, Wade turned back to the screen displaying Ace's image. The years had added silver to the marshal's hair and lines to his face, but those eyes remained the same. Watchful, analytical, uncompromising. The type of eyes that had tracked Wade across 5 states before finally cornering him at that compound. In northern Idaho, the operation had been meticulously planned for months, with each ranch targeted specifically for its genetic assets, building toward the ultimate objective at the research facility. Finding Reynolds here, in this particular county, involved in this particular situation, It couldn't be coincidence. The universe rarely allowed for such perfect symmetry without purpose. 7 years ago, Reynolds had cost Wade millions in assets, his operational infrastructure, and very nearly his freedom. Justice demanded balance. By tomorrow morning, Reynolds would understand exactly what it meant to lose everything he valued. Wade picked up the secure satellite phone and dialed a number from memory. When the call connected, he spoke briefly. "Accelerate the timeline. All teams operational by 2200. And pull everything you can find on U.S. Marshal Mason Reynolds, particularly his activities after Idaho." The response from the other end was evidently not what he wanted to hear. Wade's expression darkened. "I don't care what security clearances you need to circumvent. Find out why he's here and whether it's connected to our operation." He ended the call without waiting for acknowledgement. Across the room, Lisa Reeves watched this exchange with growing unease. She had worked with Wade for 3 years, valuing his professionalism and attention to detail. The man she was observing now, obsessed with a personal vendetta, allowing emotion to influence operational planning, was a dangerous deviation from the leader she had chosen to follow. Quietly, she sent a text message to Mercer. "Watch him closely. This is becoming something we didn't sign up for." Meanwhile, at the surveillance station, the technician monitoring Evergreen Ranch frowned at his screen. "That's odd," he muttered to himself, adjusting his equipment. 3 of their carefully placed cameras on the property had gone offline within the past hour. The pattern of failures suggested deliberate action rather than technical malfunction. Someone was systematically dismantling their surveillance network, someone who knew exactly what to look for and how to disable it without triggering alerts. He should report this to Wade immediately, but hesitated, recognizing the commander's volatile mood. Perhaps Mercer would be the safer option. As he reached for his radio, a 4th camera went dark, this one positioned to monitor the approach to the main ranch house. Reynolds wasn't just aware of their surveillance, he was actively countering it with professional efficiency. The technician swallowed hard. This operation had just become significantly more complicated. Back at Evergreen Ranch, Ace knelt beside a disabled trail camera, hidden in a cluster of sagebrush near his eastern fence line. He'd found and neutralized 7 such devices in the past hour, working systematically through the locations his experience told him would be most valuable for surveillance. "That's the 4th blind spot we've created," Ryan reported, keeping his voice low despite being well out of range of any functioning monitoring equipment. Eastern approach, North Ridge Line, access road, and now the main house perimeter. "Good," Ace replied, carefully placing the disabled camera back exactly as he'd found it. No sense alerting Wade's team that their surveillance had been compromised. Better to let them believe they still had eyes on the operation while feeding them only what Ace wanted them to see. "How's the security reinforcement at the Box Canyon coming? Mike and Jamie have it locked down tight. Those bulls aren't going anywhere unless we move them ourselves." Ryan hesitated, then added, "But it feels obvious, boss. If I were planning to steal valuable livestock, that canyon is exactly where I'd expect them to be hidden." Ace smiled slightly. "That's the point. We want them looking at the canyon while we focus on protecting what really matters. The research facility. That, and something Wade doesn't know we know about yet." Ace stood, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. The sun was lowering toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the ranch. Soon, darkness would provide cover for Wade's operation, and for Ace's countermeasures. Sheriff Daniels has deputies positioned discreetly around the research facility, and Agent Cortez is coordinating with their security team. They're ready. He checked his watch. "Let's get back to the house. The community meeting starts in 30 minutes, and we need everyone to be clear on the plan." As they walked back toward the main ranch complex, Ryan asked the question that had been on his mind all day. "Boss, this Wade character, What's the history there? Seems like there's something personal behind all this. Ace was silent for a long moment, weighing how much to share. Finally, he said, 7 years ago, I led a task force targeting a network of arms dealers operating across the Northwest. The investigation led us to Carson Wade, a former military contractor who'd gone into business for himself, selling weapons, among other things, classified technologies, intelligence, even specialized personnel for private military operations. Ace's expression darkened with the memory. We tracked him to a compound in northern Idaho, but the operation went bad. Wade had been tipped off, had his people waiting for us. Ryan could tell from Ace's tone that this part of the story carried emotional weight. What happened? 2 deputies and a federal agent died in the ensuing firefight. Wade escaped, but not before we seized significant evidence and froze most of his assets. He left the country for several years, presumably rebuilding his operation overseas. Ace paused. I never expected to encounter him again, especially not here. And now he's stealing cattle. Ryan sounded skeptical. Seems like a step down from international arms dealing. The cattle are just cover for the real objective. The genetic repository at the research facility. Those materials are worth millions on the international black market and can be transported with minimal risk. Ace shook his head. But finding me here, involved in this situation, that changes the equation for Wade. He's not the type to believe in coincidence. You think he's figured out who you are? If he hasn't already, he will soon, and when he does, his operational priorities will shift. Ace's voice carried absolute certainty. Wade combines professional discipline with a streak of vindictiveness. Once he realizes I'm involved, this becomes personal for him. They reached the main house, where vehicles were already arriving for the community meeting. Sheriff Daniels' patrol car was parked beside Agent Cortez's SUV, and various trucks belonging to local ranchers lined the driveway. Inside, the living room had been transformed into an impromptu command center. Maps of the county covered one wall, with key locations marked and potential routes highlighted. Beth Wilson had brought her veterinary records, now spread across a table where she was reviewing them with Agent Cortez. Maggie was organizing food and coffee for the assembled group, while Will Hargrove held court with several other ranchers, sharing his knowledge of the area's back roads and hidden trails. Sheriff Daniels approached as Ace entered. "Got some news. You should hear," he said quietly, leading Ace to a less crowded corner of the room. "My contact at the state police ran that license plate from the fake feed truck. Vehicle was reported stolen from a rental company in Billings 3 days ago." "Expected, but useful confirmation," Ace noted. "Any word from your deputies watching the research facility?" "Nothing unusual so far, but their security director found something interesting during their internal review." The sheriff lowered his voice further. "Someone accessed their computer system 2 weeks ago. A subtle intrusion that didn't trip any alarms, but left traces their IT people just discovered. The intruder was specifically targeting inventory data for their premium genetic storage. This aligned with Wade's methodical approach, thorough intelligence gathering before any physical operation. They know exactly what they're after," Ace concluded. "Specific samples, not just general theft." Agent Cortez joined them, her expression serious. "Just got off the phone with my supervisor in Helena. The Bureau has been tracking a pattern of similar thefts across 3 states, valuable genetic materials taken from research facilities, usually after diversionary incidents in the surrounding area. Wade's operation," Ace confirmed. "That's just it," Cortez continued. "Based on the methodology and intelligence requirements, our analysts suspected a former military contractor might be involved, but we had no specific name until now. Carson Wade wasn't on our radar for this." Ace wasn't surprised. Wade had always been careful to compartmentalize his operations, using different teams and methodologies for different criminal enterprises. "He's adaptive," Arms dealing became too hot after Idaho, so he shifted to a different market with similar profit margins but lower law enforcement priority. Stolen bull semen doesn't exactly make national headlines, Sheriff Daniels agreed wryly. But the profit margins are comparable, Agent Cortez added. International buyers will pay premium prices for genetic material that would be difficult or impossible to obtain legally, particularly from champion bloodlines that could transform their domestic breeding programs. The room was filled now with community members, each bringing specific knowledge and skills to the collective defense effort. Ace surveyed the gathered group, ranchers, townspeople, law enforcement, all united against a common threat. Wade might have professional operators and military-grade equipment, but he lacked what this community possessed: intimate knowledge of the terrain and the unbreakable bonds of people protecting their own. "Let's get started," Ace announced, bringing the room to attention. "Based on what we know about the operation targeting our community, we're expecting them to move tonight. Their primary objective is the genetic repository at the research facility. But they'll use multiple diversions to divide our resources and attention." He moved to the map on the wall. "Sheriff Daniels and Agent Cortez will coordinate the defense of the research facility, but we need to be prepared for simultaneous actions at multiple locations." His finger traced potential approach routes. "They've already conducted reconnaissance on several ranches, including Evergreen, Davidson's Place, and Paradise Valley. Each of these locations could see diversionary activities." Will Hargrove raised his hand. "What about those of us who aren't law enforcement? What's our role in all this?" "Eyes and ears," Ace replied. "You know this land better than any outsider possibly could. Each of you will be positioned to monitor specific areas, reporting any unusual activity through the communication network Beth and Maggie have established." Beth stood, addressing the group. "We've set up a phone tree system using the clinic's emergency line as the central hub. Any suspicious activity gets reported there, then disseminated to everyone who needs to know." The meeting continued, with Ace assigning specific roles and positions to each community member, carefully balancing their knowledge of the land with their individual capabilities. Young ranch hands with night vision equipment would monitor ridge lines, while older ranchers with intimate knowledge of hidden trails would position themselves at key choke points. Maggie's Diner would serve as a public-facing command center, its normal operations providing perfect cover for the information gathering happening behind the scenes. Throughout the planning, Ace maintained a calm, authoritative presence that inspired confidence. This wasn't his first time coordinating a complex operation against a dangerous adversary, and that experience showed in every aspect of his approach. As the meeting concluded and people began moving to their assigned positions, Agent Cortez approached Ace again. "You've done this before," she observed. "Not just manhunting, but commanding a joint operation with civilian components." "A few times," Ace acknowledged with characteristic understatement. "Wade doesn't know what he's walking into," she continued. "He's expecting standard law enforcement response patterns, not this." She gestured to the organized chaos of community, members preparing to defend their own. "That's our advantage," Ace agreed. "Wade studies patterns and exploits predictable responses. What we're doing here doesn't fit any playbook he's familiar with." As darkness fell over Evergreen Ranch, the community defense network moved into position. The trap was set, not with sophisticated technology or overwhelming firepower, but with the one resource Wade couldn't match: a community united in purpose and guided by a man who understood exactly how his adversary thought. The hunter who had spent years tracking the most dangerous fugitives across America was about to turn the tables, transforming his peaceful ranch into the perfect trap for a predator who had no idea he had become the prey. Stars speckled the Montana night sky as Ace moved silently through the shadows of his own property, cutter padding soundlessly beside him. It was 1:45 a.m., 15 minutes before Wade's operation was scheduled to begin, according to intelligence gathered from Beth's compromised computer system, which they had intentionally left vulnerable as a channel for misinformation. Evergreen Ranch appeared quiet and minimally defended to any watching eyes. The main house showed only a single light in what appeared to be the kitchen, suggesting its occupant had turned in for the night. The regular security measures were visible, basic motion-sensing lights, standard locks, but nothing that would deter determined professionals. It was exactly what Wade would expect from a legitimate ranching operation with modest security upgrades. The perfect target. What Wade couldn't see was the network of local ranchers and townspeople positioned strategically throughout the surrounding area, each person equipped with night vision equipment borrowed from hunting supplies, communicating through a system of short-range radios operating on frequencies Wade's team wouldn't monitor. Locals who knew every rock, tree, and dip in the landscape were now serving as Ace's eyes and ears, creating a surveillance network no amount of sophisticated equipment could match. "Coyote 1 to Homestead," came Will Hargrove's raspy voice through the secure earpiece Ace wore. The old rancher had insisted on taking a position on the ridge overlooking the eastern approach. Two vehicles approaching from the logging road. "Lights off, moving slowly. Four-man team based on thermal signatures. Copy Coyote 1, Ace responded quietly. Maintain position and continue observation." Almost simultaneously, Beth's voice came through. "Medical to Homestead. Activity at the research facility perimeter. Security cameras on the east fence just went dark." Everything was proceeding exactly as Ace had anticipated. Wade was launching simultaneous operations, one at the research facility as the apparent main objective, another approaching Evergreen Ranch, likely as a diversionary strike or secondary target. What Wade didn't know was that the research facility's most valuable materials had been quietly relocated hours earlier, replaced with decoy samples that would pass cursory inspection. Meanwhile, the apparent minimal security at Evergreen Ranch concealed a carefully orchestrated trap. Ace checked his watch again. 1:50 a.m. "All positions maintain radio discipline. Report only significant developments. Remember, we let them commit fully before we respond." Inside his command center, concealed behind the bookcase in his study, Ace watched the feeds from hidden cameras showing Wade's teams moving into position. The operation was professional, methodical, each person moving with military precision, using hand signals rather than radio communications, approaching from multiple angles to minimize detection. "Ranch hand to Homestead," Ryan's voice came through, tense but controlled. "Two men approaching the north pasture fence line. Appears they're preparing to cut through." "Copy. Ranch hand," Ace acknowledged. "Let them proceed. All positions, remember. Our objective is identification and evidence gathering. Sheriff's deputies and federal agents will make any arrests." The plan was careful, calculated, and designed to protect civilians while gathering the evidence needed for formal charges. Wade's operation spanned multiple states and would require a coordinated federal response to dismantle completely. Tonight's goal wasn't just to protect the ranch and research facility, but to document Wade's criminal enterprise sufficiently for prosecution. At precisely 2 a.m., the operation began in earnest. The team at the research facility triggered a carefully controlled breach of the perimeter fence, while simultaneously 3 separate teams converged on Evergreen Ranch, one approaching the main house, one targeting the barn complex, and one heading toward the box canyon where the valuable bulls were kept. Ace switched between camera feeds, watching the choreographed movements of Wade's operators. They were good, professional, disciplined, and well-equipped, but they were working from a flawed understanding of what they were facing. "Coyote 2 to Homestead. came Frank Wilcox's steady voice. "Wade is with the team approaching your main house. Confirmed visual on target." Ace's jaw tightened. As expected, Wade had made this personal, leading the team targeting the ranch house himself. "Copy, Coyote 2, all positions. Wade is on site. I repeat, the primary target is confirmed on the property." Through the monitors, Ace watched as Wade's team methodically approached the main house. 4 operators in tactical gear moving with the synchronized precision of men who had trained together extensively. Wade himself was unmistakable, the same confident stride, the same calculating assessment of his surroundings that Ace remembered from their previous encounter. The moment Wade's team breached the back door of the ranch house, Ace initiated the next phase. "Sheriff, they've entered the main house. You can move on to the research facility team now." Across town, Sheriff Daniels gave the signal, and deputies concealed around the research facility perimeter moved in on Wade's diversion team. Simultaneously, Agent Cortez and her FBI tactical unit emerged from hiding to intercept the team targeting the Box Canyon. At the main house, Ace watched as Wade's team systematically searched the ground floor, clearly looking for something specific. Wade directed them with hand signals, pointing to locations that should be checked thoroughly. They moved from room to room with practiced efficiency, finding nothing but ordinary ranch house furnishings. "Status report, all positions," Ace requested. Quietly, Sheriff to Homestead. "Research facility team contained 4 suspects in custody." Federal to Homestead. "Canyon team intercepted 3 suspects detained without incident." Ranch hand to Homestead. "Barn team still operational, searching the storage areas. Everything was proceeding according to plan." 3 of the 4 teams had been neutralized, leaving only Wade's personal squad in the main house and the team at the barn. Now came the most delicate part of the operation, capturing Wade himself. Ace moved silently through the tunnel that connected his hidden command center to a concealed exit behind the equipment shed, positioning himself to approach the house. Undetected. 7 years ago in Idaho, Wade had escaped because Ace had followed procedure, bringing overwhelming force but telegraphing their approach. Tonight would be different. Inside the main house, Wade was growing increasingly frustrated. The office he'd expected to find, filled with intelligence and evidence, was nothing but a simple ranch office. Bills, cattle records, and agricultural magazines. No hidden files. No sophisticated communications equipment. Nothing to suggest its owner was anything more than what he appeared to be on paper. "There's nothing here," reported one of his men, confusion evident in his voice, despite his professional demeanor. "Keep looking," Wade ordered sharply. "Check for hidden compartments, false walls, concealed safes." His eyes scanned the room, looking for inconsistencies, anything that might reveal Reynolds' true nature. He was in the Marshal's service. He'll have backup equipment, contingency plans, emergency resources. As his team continued their increasingly desperate search, Wade noticed something odd about the bookcase in the study. The spacing was slightly off, suggesting it might conceal something behind it. He approached carefully, examining the shelving for a triggering mechanism. "Found something," he announced quietly, his fingers finding a nearly invisible catch at the edge of the shelving unit. The bookcase swung open silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing a small room beyond, the command center Ace had been using to monitor their movements. Wade stepped inside, his expression darkening as he took in the sophisticated equipment, multiple monitors showing camera feeds, and evidence that Reynolds had been tracking his operation for days. One screen showed the research facility where his team was now being taken into custody. Another displayed the Box Canyon operation, his men kneeling with hands behind their heads as FBI agents secured them. "It's a trap," he hissed, reaching for his radio to warn the team at the barn. "All units, abort immediately. Repeat, abort. They can't hear you," came a calm voice from behind him. Wade froze, then slowly turned to find Ace standing in the doorway, a pistol held casually at his side. He looked different from their last encounter, older, more weathered, but with the same unshakable calm that had made him legendary in the Marshal Service. "Reynolds," Wade acknowledged, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Should have known you'd be waiting. Should have known better than to come after my ranch." Ace countered evenly. "You're getting sloppy, Carson. Personal vendettas clouding your professional judgment." Wade's hand inched toward the weapon holstered at his hip. "You cost me everything. In Idaho." "You cost 2 deputies and a federal agent their lives," Ace corrected. "I just made sure there was a price for that." For a tense moment, the two men assessed each other, years of history hanging between them. Then Wade smiled coldly. "You think you've won? My men at the barn are rigging explosives as we speak. One word from me, and your precious ranch goes up in flames." "Your men at the barn were taken into custody 4 minutes ago," Ace informed him. "And the explosives they were carrying have been disarmed. It's over, Carson." Wade's expression flickered, but he recovered quickly. "There's always an exit strategy, Reynolds. You should know that by now." His hand moved with blinding speed toward a device on his belt, not his weapon, but what appeared to be a detonator. Ace had anticipated this. His pistol barked once, the sound deafening in the confined space. Wade's hand jerked away from the device, blood splattering from a precise wound to his forearm. "7 years ago, I made the mistake of trying to take you alive at any cost," Ace said quietly, advancing into the room. "I won't make that mistake again. The only question is whether you leave here in cuffs or a body bag. Your choice." Wade cradled his injured arm, rage and calculation warring in his eyes. "You really think this ends here? I have operations in 12 states, overseas connections, political protection you can't imagine." "Had," Ace corrected. "While you were focused on this operation, your accounts have been frozen, your contacts compromised, your safe houses identified." He nodded toward one of the monitors, which showed a document listing Wade's assets and operational infrastructure. "Agent Cortez has been very thorough with the information we provided." For the first time, uncertainty crept into Wade's expression. "What information? You've been retired for years. You couldn't possibly—" "I kept files," Ace interrupted. "Insurance, in case you ever resurfaced. Everything I couldn't prove 7 years ago, plus what we've gathered in the past week." He shrugged slightly. "Old habits." The sound of footsteps in the hall announced the arrival of Sheriff Daniels and 2 deputies. "Wade's team is secured," the sheriff reported, nodding to Ace. "Agent Cortez is bringing in the others from the Canyon operation." Wade's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly, the gesture visible only to someone who knew what to look for, the recognition of defeat, from a man unaccustomed to losing. "Doesn't matter," he said, his voice regaining some of its former confidence. "I'll be out within days. People like me don't stay in custody." "People like you eventually run out of options," Ace replied, holstering his weapon as the deputies moved to secure Wade. "And connections and luck." He stepped aside to let the sheriff handle the arrest. "Besides, you won't be facing local charges. Agent Cortez has federal warrants for activities in multiple jurisdictions. This time, there's nowhere to run." As the deputies led Wade away, he locked eyes with Ace one final time. "This isn't over, Reynolds." "Yes, Carson," Ace replied quietly. "It is." Dawn was breaking over the Bitterroot Mountains when the last of the law enforcement vehicles departed Evergreen Ranch. The combined operation had resulted in the arrest of 17 members of Wade's organization, the seizure of significant evidence documenting illegal activities across multiple states, and the recovery of all stolen cattle from previous raids. Ace stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the landscape in soft gold. Agent Cortez approached, looking tired but satisfied after a night of processing suspects and evidence. "I've been in law enforcement for 15 years, she said, accepting the cup of coffee Ace offered. "Never seen a civilian-coordinated operation." executed that flawlessly. Wasn't just me, Ace replied, nodding toward the gathering of community members in his yard. Ranchers, townspeople, and local business owners were collecting their equipment and preparing to return to their normal lives, the night's extraordinary activities already becoming stories they would tell for years to come. Wade never understood what he was really up against here. A community, Cortez acknowledged, but one led by someone who knew exactly how to leverage their knowledge and capabilities. She studied him with new respect. The Bureau could use someone with your skills, you know. Consultant position, if you're not interested in returning to full service. Ace smiled slightly. Appreciate the offer, but I've got all I need right here. His gaze swept over his ranch, the cattle now returning to their normal pastures, the land peaceful in the morning light, though I might be persuaded to provide insights on particular cases, if needed. The FBI agent nodded, understanding. I'll make that known to my superiors. In the meantime, the formal debriefing can wait until you've had some rest. You've earned it. As Cortez departed, Maggie approached with a basket of fresh biscuits and a thermos of coffee. Figured you and your hands could use some breakfast after the night you've had, she said, setting the basket on the porch table. The whole town's talking about it already, how Evergreen Ranch took down a criminal mastermind, and his entire operation. Exaggerations start early, Ace noted with amusement. Maybe, Maggie conceded, but not by much, from what I've heard. She looked at him with the same perceptive gaze that had seen through his rancher facade from the beginning. You know, when you first came to town 7 years ago, I told Jenny there was more to you than met the eye, something in the way you carried yourself, how you were always aware of everything around you. Just old habits, Ace replied. No, Maggie disagreed gently. It's who you are, the ranching, the quiet life. That's genuine too. But so is the man who organized an entire community to take down criminals that law enforcement across 3 states and couldn't catch. She patted his arm. This valley's lucky to have you, Mason Reynolds. However much of your story you choose to share. As Maggie headed back to her car, Ryan approached with Cutter trotting at his heels. The ranch foreman looked tired, but energized by the night's events, a new confidence in his bearing after successfully coordinating part of the operation. Boss, the boys and I can handle things today if you want to get some rest, he offered. Stock's all accounted for, fences repaired, and we've done a full property sweep. No sign of any leftover surprises from Wade's team. Ace nodded appreciatively. Thanks, Ryan. Good work last night. You handled yourself like a veteran. Had a good teacher, Ryan replied simply. He hesitated, then added, the hands were talking about what happens next, whether things go back to normal or... He trailed off, uncertain how to articulate the question. Normal is what we make it, Ace said after a moment. The ranch continues. That was always the plan. But I'm thinking we might implement some of what we've learned through this experience. He gestured toward the community members, still gathered in small groups around the property. This valley has something special. People who look out for each other, who come together when threatened. Seems worth building on. Over the next few weeks, life in Clearwater County did indeed establish a new normal. The cattle stolen in the raids were returned to their rightful owners. The damaged fences and equipment repaired through community effort. The research facility upgraded its security based on recommendations from Ace and Agent Cortez, ensuring its valuable genetic repository would be better protected against future threats. Wade and his organization faced federal charges that spanned multiple jurisdictions, the evidence gathered at Evergreen Ranch proving crucial in connecting previously isolated incidents into a pattern of organized criminal activity. The case made headlines briefly, then faded from public attention, as such things often do. But in Clearwater County, the events left a more lasting mark. The network of communication and mutual support that had formed during the crisis evolved into a more formalized system. Ranchers coordinated security efforts, sharing information about suspicious activities and working together to protect their properties. Beth's veterinary practice implemented new protocols for securing sensitive information, while still maintaining the personal touch that made it an essential part of the community. At Evergreen Ranch, Ace continued his work, building one of the premier Angus operations in the region. The prize bulls, safely returned from the Box Canyon, resumed their important role in advancing the genetic quality of his herd. To casual observers, little had changed. The same methodical approach to ranching, the same attention to detail, the same quiet presence at Maggie's diner on Saturday mornings. But those who knew where to look could see the subtle differences. The increased coordination between ranch hands, now trained to be more observant of their surroundings, the regular gatherings at the main house where community members discussed mutual concerns and security measures, the occasional visits from Agent Cortez, officially to follow up on the case, but increasingly taking on the character of professional consultation on other matters. 6 months after Wade's arrest, Ace stood on the ridge overlooking his property, Cutter faithfully at his side. The spring grass was emerald green, dotted with the black forms of his Angus cattle grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. From this vantage point, he could see much of the valley, neighboring ranches, the distant outline of town, the winding ribbon of the river that gave the county its name. Ryan rode up on his bay gelding, dismounting to join Ace at the outlook. "Beautiful day," he observed, taking in the view. "That it is," Ace agreed. "Just got word from Sheriff Daniels," Ryan reported. "Wade's trial has been set for September. Federal prosecutors are confident about the case. Agent Cortez said to tell you the additional evidence you provided sealed it. He won't be seeing the outside of a prison for decades, if ever." Ace nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Good news." They stood in companionable silence for a while, ranch owner and foreman, surveying the land. They worked together. Finally, Ryan spoke again. "You know, when I first signed on here, I thought I was just getting a job on a cattle ranch. Never imagined I'd end up helping take down an international criminal." "Life has a way of surprising you," Ace acknowledged. With a slight smile. "The thing is," Ryan continued thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about what you said that night, about how some skills transfer between different lives, how the attention to detail and awareness that makes a good marshal also makes a good rancher. Something on your mind, Ryan?" The younger man nodded. "I've been talking with Sheriff Daniels. He's offering me a deputy position. Says the skills I've learned from you would make me a good fit for law enforcement. Wanted to get your thoughts before I made a decision." Ace studied his foreman with pride. The young man had shown exceptional potential during the confrontation with Wade, displaying natural leadership and tactical thinking under pressure. "I think you'd make an excellent deputy. Tom's got good instincts about people." "But it would mean leaving Evergreen," Ryan pointed out. "After 3 years, it feels like leaving home." "Not leaving," Ace corrected. "Expanding your horizons. Besides," he added with a rare grin, "deputies eat breakfast too. I expect I'll still see you at Maggie's every Saturday." As they headed back down the ridge toward the ranch buildings, Ace reflected on the unexpected turn his life had taken. He had come to Clearwater County seeking peace and a new purpose after decades of tracking dangerous fugitives. He had found both, along with a community that had become family and a life that balanced his need for tranquility with opportunities to use the skills he had spent a lifetime developing. The rustlers who had targeted his ranch, ignorant of his legendary past, had inadvertently helped reveal not just who Mason Ace Reynolds had been, but who he still was. A protector, a strategist, and a man who understood that true security came not from isolation, but from connection. Evergreen Ranch continued to thrive under his stewardship, its reputation for quality Angus cattle growing with each passing season. But its true value lay in something less tangible, its role as a gathering point for a community that had learned the power of standing together, led by a quiet rancher whose past and present had merged into something new and enduring. The legend of the cowboy with a hidden past would be told in Clearwater County for generations to come, not as a tale of violence and retribution, but as a story of protection, of community, and of a different kind of courage than most would expect from a man once known as the best manhunter in the U.S. Marshal Service. As the sun began its descent toward the Bitterroot Mountains, casting long shadows across Evergreen Ranch, Ace Reynolds looked out over the land he had chosen and the life he had built, finding in both the peace he had sought and the purpose he had never truly abandoned. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.